Hey everyone, it's Megan from TwoFeetFirst, and in today's video, I'm sharing how we built a floating deck. If you're wondering, a floating deck, also called a freestanding deck, is a deck that is not attached to a structure. When we were deciding on what type of outdoor space we wanted, in our backyard, we knew that we wanted a patio, but we didn't like the idea of reinforcing a concrete patio to the foundation of our home. So a floating deck was our solution. But let's start off by sharing what the space looked like before. And because I have to share, here is what the space looked like when we purchased our home. We used a list of different materials for this build, and you can find the full list in the description below. But the main items that we used were ground contact pressure treated lumber, tough blocks, and of course, composite decking. And because you're probably wondering, we used Trex in the color Rocky Harbor. As a side note, be sure to check your local building codes to see if a floating deck is allowed in your area and if you need a permit to build one. Usually if a floating deck is a certain height and size, no permit is needed. Before building anything, we created a plan for the deck. To do this, I measured where I wanted our deck. Then I used a program called SketchUp to create our plan. They do have a free version if you would like to give it a try. This build would have been a lot easier if the deck was square or rectangular, but as you can see, our deck was not. Remember that the deck boards, the composite boards, will be perpendicular to the joist, so the pressure treated lumber. So decide on which direction you want the deck boards to go, then design the framing to work in that direction. For example, we decided we wanted our decking boards to run from the house to the yard. So in other words, south to north. So our joist needs to run perpendicular to that. So it needs to run east to west. I will go into more detail about the spacing for the framing, blocking, and decking later in the video, which will help you create your own plan. So stay tuned for that information. There are many different ways to create the foundation of a floating deck. We decided to use a system called Tough Blocks because of how easy they are to install and their low profile, which would allow our deck to be inches from the ground. Tough Blocks are designed to allow the proper ventilation under the deck, which will allow airflow to circulate so you will not have a moisture issue under your deck. We decided to have a 2-inch gravel base for the foundation to allow for water drainage from the deck, plus to make it easier to level the tough blocks. So the first thing we did was remove 2 inches of dirt from the area. To give us a crisp edge, I used string attached to stakes to give us the markings of where to cut in with the square shovel. Then I used a rake to level the area. We also installed plastic landscape edging between the soon-to-be gravel area and grass. This will help keep the grass out, but also the gravel in place. And as you can see in the background, my husband is using a stamper to flatten the dirt. After all the dirt was removed and the plastic landscape edging was installed, I did install a weed fabric barrier to help keep the weeds away. Then we added the 2 inches of gravel to the area, making sure it's slightly sloped away from the house to allow water to drain away. At this point, the foundation is ready for the blocks, which will be placed and leveled during the next couple of steps. And because I want to give you a close-up, here is that landscape edging.
The next step is framing the floor of the deck, but you will need to place the blocking while you're building the framing. So let's talk about the spacing requirements for this type of blocking based on the company's instructions, which I will link to below. It is recommended to have a tough block no more than 12 inches from the edge of the outside framing to the center of the block. Within the span of a floor joist, the block should not span more than 50 inches. And you need a tough block on every joist of the framing. The joist will be spaced 16 inches on center, but we'll talk about that more in a later step. The outside framing of the deck will have at least 2 long joists where the blocking will sit. Then there will be rim joists that run perpendicular to these boards to support the blocks and tie the other joists together. But you will also want to add additional rim joists parallel to the long joists to allow you to hide the blocking from view. Sometimes it's called a double end joist. This is done by using sleepers that are short boards running between the joists to provide extra support. Depending on the size of your deck, there could be a center beam running between the 2 outside boards. To start building the framing of the floating deck, you first need to secure the perimeter framing of the deck, which is the outside edge. But if you are building the deck close to another structure, like we are, you will need to allow spacing between the framing and the structure. The spacing recommended is between 1 inch to 2 inches. We decided to have a 1 inch space. Another spacing you might want to consider if you plan on having fascia around the framing is planning on the additional board for that. In our case, we decided to use a regular rounded edge decking board as our fascia. So we needed to plan an additional inch board in some areas, plus we wanted a slight overhang on the decking board. Start building the outside perimeter of the framing by measuring the distance and subtracting the spacing needed, then cut the outside rim joist boards to these measurements. I like to check the fitting of the board, then attach them together by pre-drilling 2 to 3 1/8 inch holes through the side board, then using 3-inch exterior screws that can be used with pressure-treated lumber to secure the boards together, and continue this process for the perimeter boards of the framing. You will notice that we did install a double end joist as well. Our sleepers, small boards between the 2 joists, were no more than 10 inches long. Plus, we do have a beam running down the middle of the framing. This is because the length of one side of the deck was 12 feet long and we didn't want the spacing any longer without extra support. Remember to place the tough blocks in place while you're building the perimeter of your deck. If you are building a rectangle or square deck, make sure you square your framing. So now it's time to level the decking because right now it's not level. For example, this one is not even sitting on the block, so we need to hurry and level that. But that's the problem with this type of one. It's so large and not rectangle that I'm gonna hurry and try to level it as best as I can. And the middle section of the deck, I'm going to be using these hanging joists. I believe that's what they're called. They're a joist hanger. So this one is for this one, and then I'm doing this one too. So this is on my cut edges where it's angled. I'm going to bend this so that it'll work for that. So these are the 2 I'm using. Also, I'm using the screws that are recommended for those hanging joists. Here's where we're at, and these are the ones that I'm going to be attaching. These ones, as you can see, I use screws through them, and so this is the outside frame. And then I leveled everything before, but now I've cut all these to fit in the areas, and now I'm going to attach them. But they are 16 inches on center, and so I have marked each of these for where they should go. And so I've done that all the way across and all the way over there on the other side. I need to position these tough blocks so that they're the correct distance too. From reading their instructions on the tough blocks, it's recommended that it is no more than 12 inches from center. So that would be like this edge and 12 inches to that one, the middle. So I'm going to hurry and mark the boards just so I know exactly where those are. And then from this one to the next one is supposed to be no more than 50 inches between the two. And so I'm going to move these around to give me that spacing that I need as well. I have a lot in some areas right now just because it's just holding up the boards until I get them attached. The tricky part of my deck framing was the angles. To cut a joist at an angle, I would place a board in the general area where the joist should be installed. I measured the boards so that it would be 16 inches on center from the last joist. From there, I used a sliding T-bevel to determine the angle of the cut. I adjusted the saw to this angle, then measured the length of the board and cut the joist to size. I then attached the joist with a joist hanger. The angle end of the joist was secured into place by bending an angle joist hanger to fit that angle. Now that the deck framing is basically installed, we're going to put some supports in between these just to make it a little bit sturdier. So I'm going to hurry and measure those and then cut them and install them. I also decided to sand the edges of the joist to make sure everything was level. After all the framing was installed, I sealed the joists with some joist tape. This helps protect and maximize the life of the deck. So here's the different ends of the boards. These ones have the grooves, and those ones do not. So those will be for the picture frame and the sides. And this is the main decking. If you want your deck to look custom and professional, I would recommend installing fascia and having a picture frame border because they bring it all together. Also, decking needs to have gaps between other decking boards, but also structures. For example, the board around our house and fence need a gap of a ½ inch because our temperatures get really cold in winter. Be sure to check the company's instructions for the exact gap. Make sure to keep this in mind when you're installing all decking boards and adjust accordingly. The fascia will be placed on the front of the framing to hide the pressure-treated lumber. To install the board, I measured one section and cut the square edge board to that measurement with a 45-degree angle. This way the boards would fit together in a seamless finish. After, I checked the fit by clamping the boards into place and cutting the next section. I then placed the next section to see if any boards needed to be adjusted. Then I secured the first board to the rim joist using a 2 3/4 inch decking screws that was in the same color as the decking board. You need to place at least 2 screws in a row and place them about 18 inches apart. I recommend pre-drilling the holes first, then attaching the screws. Once the fascia is all installed, it's time to install the picture frame of the deck. It's called a picture frame because it frames out the deck. We decided to only add the picture frame to the areas that were not against our house or fence. For most corners, you would cut your square edge board at a 45-degree angle. But if your framing is like ours and not 90-degree corners in some areas, you will need to adjust the cut for that area. The first cut of our picture frame, we measured the distance from the house to the first corner. We subtracted a 1/2 inch to allow the gap required for the decking being next to the solid wall, but we also wanted a 1/2 inch overhang on the picture frame, so we ended up being the same measurement. I cut the square edge decking board at 0 degrees to place it against the house, and then I cut the board to the measurement from before, but this time I cut it at a 45-degree angle where the measurement was at the farthest point of the cut. Also, make sure that you're cutting the board at the right angle so you don't waste the board. I tested the fit of the board and clamped it into place. Then I measured and cut the next board, but this time both edges would be at an angle. I placed this board to check the fit, adjusting either board if needed, then secured the first board into place by pre-drilling 2 1/8 inch holes at one end of the board. After I used 2.5 inch decking screws to secure the board into place. Continue adding screws about every 18 inches until the board is fully secured to the framing. Continue this process of measuring, cutting, and securing the square edge decking board until you have your whole picture frame. When it comes to cutting different angles on the picture frame, because our deck had different angles, to determine the cut, I used the T-bevel tool and scrap boards. I tested the angle of the scrap boards first before making the cut on the actual decking board. I would recommend doing this. Now that the picture frame is installed, it's time to install the rest of the decking board. Start on one side of the deck, measure the distance from the picture frame border to the house in our case. But you will need to adjust this measurement to allow the gap against the house and the gap where the boards are next to each other. For our deck, the gaps are a 1/2 inch and a 1/4 inch. So we need to subtract 3/4 inch from this measurement. We are using Trex hidden fasteners to give us a clean, seamless look. I also used a scrap 1/4 inch board to give me the gap next to the picture frame when measuring and installing the boards. Cut a groove edge deck board to this measurement, then test the fit, adjusting if needed. To start the first row of the main decking, you need to secure the start clips to each joist a 1/4 inch away from the picture frame. Then place the board you just cut into the clips using the groove. Make sure you have the appropriate gaps at the end of the board. Next, take the hidden fasteners with a scrap grooved edge deck board and secure the fastener onto the center of each joist. Do not fully tighten the fastener. The screw heads should be flush with the top of the deck board. Use the scrap deck board to keep the fastener in place. Once there is a fastener on each joist, measure and cut the next board. Place this board into place, making sure the fasteners are within the groove of the board and the board has the appropriate gaps on each end. Again, take the hidden fasteners and secure the new board into place at each joist. Remember not to fully tighten the screws. After, go back to the previous row of fasteners and fully tighten each one. Continue this process until the last deck board. If you need to cut around an item, like a windowsill, use a jigsaw to cut out the area. I found it helpful to use painter's tape to see the markings. I also used a piece of paper to create a template to trace the design around the deck board. Continue adding the rest of the decking boards using the same method. For the last board, you may need to cut the width of the board to fit into the space. If you are cutting the width, it is recommended to use a square edge board. You will need to fasten this board to the joist with a standard decking screws, the same ones you use for the picture frame. You will also need to create a groove in the sides of this square edge board to allow the fasteners to sit properly from the previous board. If you can use a router for this, or if you have one, a biscuit joiner. If you're wondering how much it costs to build a floating deck, obviously the size of the deck is a big factor in determining the cost, but also the material. I also want to note that none of the materials were sponsored for this project. We purchased all the supplies ourselves. So the cost of our deck, which is about 200 square feet, was $2,800 for all materials. And if you want a breakdown of the cost, be sure to visit my website to get a full detailed breakdown. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and thanks for watching.